Hello everybody. So today I'm here with a topic that I actually want to talk about for a rather long time, especially because during 2.8 and 3.0, a lot of people were kind of asking for my opinion about Chisa and the whole Chisa conspiracy thing. And even though I didn't really talk much about it, I think it's rather funny, like the whole kind of like potential Chisa potential meme. I'm sure you guys have heard about it before. Um, I am rather understanding of the fact it is a joke. Like 80% of it is a joke. I don't think people fully kind of like believe in the conspiracy. But one thing I do find rather interesting is, despite all of this kind of like humor around it, if there is any character that holds the title of the potential woman, then it has to be Camellya, as you can see on the screen over here. And I think it's honestly rather surprising that more people don't really talk about it, because I think that Camellya's lore, from a lore perspective, is really criminally underrated. And if there's anyone that's gonna be hold the title of the potential woman, it has to be Camellya. So let's talk about it. So first things first, unfortunately, I am aware that over the course of my YouTube career in the Wuthering Wave space, a lot of people have told me to make a Camellya video. Unfortunately, this is not exactly a Camellya Resonator video. That is still to be made. It's more so just a PowerPoint Yup video where I talk about Camellya and her lore, and not so much about the symbolism and references, unfortunately, today. But with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about Chisa. I'm sure you guys know about the Chisa conspiracy meme, like, oh, did you say potential? You can see a bit of a collage of all this stuff over here. And yeah, as I said before, it seems rather interesting that Chisa is a potential woman when there is someone who has been sitting in our faces all this time that really should be taking a position that she has in the community. So, we need to talk a little bit about, okay, of course, about Chisa, right? Chisa shows up all the time. Everyone thinks that she is the potential woman because of like humor and like lore reasons. She shows up in, the 3.4 stream. And it's kind of funny because in 3.3, of course, she didn't have any voice lines. But yeah, like I feel like she is widely overstated, especially relative to Camellya and her value in the story, right? She didn't speak any words in 3.3. She doesn't really have any relevance in 3.3. And she just appears randomly all the time, right? So, of course, the 007 meme, you guys get the point, right? So, when it comes to why Shisa actually has potential, the only real reasons we can scrounge up is either just like memes that, oh yeah, she's gonna solo everybody, she's gonna save Ameth, when that wasn't the case, the Exo Bro, Exo Strider did that for us. Um, but as you can see from the other options, like, there really isn't much, right? We're really grasping at straws here. But I want to present to you another option for the potential woman where we're not just inhaling copium, and we are actually really touching on actual lore points that have immense potential. And let me introduce to you Camellya, right? As you can already see already from this slide, there's an enormously long list. And all of these things are based on lore. They're not just like coping like, oh yeah, Chisa's gonna solo LF2 or whatever, right? These are actual points in the lore, right? Let's just go through the list. We're going to talk about this a bit more, but let's just go through the list, right? Camellya has the most potential of nearly any character in the story thus far. She is one of the oldest characters in existence. We don't exactly know how old she is, but she's might be as old as Shorekeeper. Might potentially be nearly as old as Rover, and in my opinion, I think she's definitely older than Frolova, right? There is also a character story that confirms that Shisa predates at least some lament. So it's probably not older than the lament, but she definitely predates a lot of laments, right? And she's lasted for such a long time, and yet her body has not degraded. We're going to talk about Camellya's body later on in the video because it's a very, very interesting case. We're going to talk about that later. And Camellya, because she's so old, she's been all over Solaris. she actually has so much information knowledge. The only problem is that she forgets it. And we're going to talk about that a bit later because she has a condition called vegetative, um, what was it again? Oh, vegetative somatization, right? So she has a specific condition, but if she did not have that condition, she would probably literally know the secret of the world. And that's actually specifically stated within her character stories. She knows the truth of not just her own existence, but also of the lament. That's just how old she is, right? Camellya is also one of the only two potential, but like with Camellya, it's basically confirmed. The only two potential artificial resonators. So artificial resonators are people who are either artificial humans, like homunculi, like kind of like fake humans, or they went through an artificial kind of like awakening, right? And I want to quickly remind you that this is a really big deal. The only other artificial resonator we know of in the current Lena story that potentially is artificial is Denia, right? And given that we have just finished 3.3, I don't really need to stress how important Denia is, considering that her artificial resonance enabled her to become a vessel of an eldritch space god Frenodian, right? So the potential behind Camellya also being a basically confirmed artificial resonator is immense, right? Besides that, of all of the characters that we've seen so far, even surpassing the likes of Relova, Camellya has probably overclocked more times than not just probably all the characters we know of thus far, she's probably clocked so many times she ranks basically of the most overclocked people in terms of the entirety of Solaris. And the really important part of this is that a lot of people overclock, once or twice or 5 times, and then they die because overclocking is a really serious condition. But in the case of Camellya, she doesn't. And we're going to talk about this a bit more later in terms of her body, because it's actually a kind of miracle that she's still somehow alive after doing this, right? And the other thing that's rather interesting is that unlike a lot of other characters that are stuck to Rover because of past anecdotes and feelings and whatever, Camellya is a bit different. A lot of people are confused why Camellya is obsessed with Rover, but it's actually, in a way, imprinted on her soul. We don't exactly know how that works because she's an artificial resonator, but she is so stuck on the Rover, not out of her own choice, but because the people that created her designed her to basically yearn for Rover, literally, right? Besides that, we also talked about the fact that Camellya has been to nearly every corner of Solaris, and she even says that she's explored Solaris so much that there's nothing in the entire world that entertains her, right? And the other thing that some people may know is that Camellya the people that created her most likely come from an ancient organization that wanted to assassinate Rover. And it was most likely not the Firaxis, which I think a lot of people theorize, because she was so old that when she was made, there were multiple factions that were trying to oppose Rover, not just the Firaxis, right? And within this organization, she was called the Chosen Seed. We're going to talk about that a lot later because this is also going to be really important, right? So, as you can probably tell, Camellya's potential, unlike Chisa, is not just a meme, it's legitimately baked into the lore. And the reason why I say that Camellya is the real potential woman is that she possibly understands the secret of the entire world, but she just forgot it, right? Because she says, for example, she's lived for centuries. She could predate even the lament, right? Like she was one of Rover's closest aides. Like if that isn't potential, then I really don't know what is, right? Like there is so much capacity for Camellya to be like a secret character that literally understands the fundamental laws and controlling forces of the world. As I would say a lot in this video, there is so much potential that the potential is, it's just potentially, okay? So, we need to talk about this from the beginning, because I think that a lot of people played through Camellya's story, but they actually don't fully understand the value and potential she has as a character, right? Because her story was kind of flawed in the regard that we learn a lot about what she's been doing recently, but as we said before, Camellya is potentially centuries, even thousands of years old, right? And when it comes to an MSQ, a main story quest, it focuses a lot on basically the 20-year time frame. She disappeared 20 years ago when Rover kind of like wiped their memories and left the Black Shores, and then eventually she came back to Black Shores on accident, right? But we learned that even before that, she was originally someone called Lady Flora from Petalfall Village, and she's actually sealed her memories multiple times in order to deal with like the consequences of overclocking and past trauma. What that past trauma is, we'll talk about later. And you can also basically see how important Rover was to Lady Flora and Camellya, right? So comparing this, which is basically what happens in a main story quest, with like the potential here, you'll probably see that there is a rather large impasse, I guess you can say, a rather large difference in terms of her potential, right? And the problem with this is that a lot of Camellya's stories lock behind her character stories, right? Even though the character story, like her main story quest, focuses a lot on just the 20-year time frame, she is way, way older than what the main story quests actually paint her as. In fact, she is at the very, very minimum centuries years old, and when it comes to possibilities of potential, she could be thousands of years old. And we're going to talk about why that is later. But you can see from her stories, like when she remembers everything, when she understands, can process, unlock all of her memories and experiences, her true potential, if you will. Let's just play with the meme a bit, right? When she unlocks her true potential, when she remembers everything, she knows not just who she is, she knows who Rover truly is. She knows why she exists, right? Because that's really important, because she was an artificial resonator that was designed to like assassinate Rover. She understands the nature of the world of Solaris, and she understands the laments. So it's not much of an exaggeration to see that Camellya at peak performance literally rivals like Rover in terms of understanding the true secrets of the world. She might even rival, for example, the Grand Architect, right? The problem is that having access to these memories causes her immense physical injury and mental trauma. So she can't actually unlock too much of her memories at once. And that is really where the potential comes in, because she has the potential to be such a well-versed and knowledged character in the game. So, of course, that goes into, right, why Camellya is the potential woman, right? The reason why she is the potential woman is because even though she can know so many of these things, there is a law reason why she can't access most of her memories, which is a condition within her resonator report called vegetative somatization, right? And in summary, what she does is that she often has to delete or repress her memories because it causes her to overclock, like her emotions cause her to overclock and undergo like physical trauma, like somatization, right? When mental conditions translate into physical injury. And because of that, she oftentimes has to basically not survive based on memory, but more so based on instinct, right? But besides overclocking, you can kind of imagine that if the memories that she holds, the knowledge that she holds is so damaging and dangerous that she would rather delete them than have to suffer through and know them, that puts her almost in a similar condition with Rover, who also memory wiped, right? So you can kind of see that there's so much potential with Camellya. It's just that there is a artificial law reason why she can't access or know these things. There's so much potential, right? So before we kind of go into understanding why Camellya has so much potential, I'm sure you guys have a bit of an idea already. We need to understand a bit of the chronology, because I think that this is one of the biggest things that people don't understand about Camellya, right? Camellya's main story quest focuses on the 20-year time frame, but as we said before, she is way older than that, right? It's a lot of her stories behind kind of like the centuries and stuff like that are really locked behind her character stories. So I've taken the liberty to essentially construct an estimated timeline. This is not going to be very accurate, to piece together how long she's truly lived and all of the major events she's gone through based on our current knowledge, right? And you can probably, well, I hope that once you see this chronology, you will start to understand the scale in terms of how much potential and importance that Camellya has in the plot, right? Let's go through this. So, the very first indication of Camellya that we know of is, of course, her birth, right? Camellya is most likely an artificial resonator, and there's a lot of clues that push towards the fact that Camellya is not like, for example, she didn't go through artificial resonance. She actually is a kind of artificial human, right? There's a lot of, for example, kind of like instances in a story where she, like, they talk about how she took drugs, she was fed like chemicals. There's like, for example, it says here, like, you know, she has an instinctual yearning for Rover, which is why like she chases after Rover so much. That was literally coded into her like body or like brain or something, right? So she's created as an artificial resonator an undisclosed amount of time ago, and we don't know how much time happened between 1 or 2, but the next thing we know is that she was sent by a specific organization to assassinate Rover, but for some reason she failed to do this and she actually gave Rover a flower instead. So I think that there was actually a pretty large amount of time between 1 or 2, because it was actually mentioned that Camellya had to kind of stalk Rover for a really long time before like going through the assassination, right? And for some reason she failed and chose to give Rover a flower instead. So that kind of suggests that she has a degree of autonomy, or she broke away from the organization that created her, right? And after number 2, in her stories, it's said that, you know, like you can kind of see this over here, she spent centuries wandering around Solaris. How many centuries, we don't know, but it was long enough that basically the scene before her would vanish in the lament, right? She would endlessly wander through a labyrinth of memories until one autumn morning in Petalfall Village, she would meet Rover again, right? So she wanders around Solaris for literal centuries, so long that she's able to witness cities, countries fall to the lament. She witnesses the tide of civilization, right? And after this massive amount of time, these centuries, she meets Rover again in Petalfall Village. And this is the first time that she meets Rover in Petalfall Village. This is really important. And she helps Rover defend against like a TD attack. And basically, because of that, she joins the Blackshores, right? And this is where she would join the Blackshores as Lady Flora. And this is like the Lady Flora that you would know from Camellya's story, that she served in the Blackshores before. And it says as well, from there, she would join the Blackshores and share a few hundred years together, right? So she spent another couple of centuries in the Blackshores after she was wandering for a few centuries. You can kind of see like there is a massive amount of time that is occurring between here, right? So she joins the Lady Flora, she serves in the Blackshores for a couple of centuries, and then what happens is that Rover wipes their memories, right? This is kind of like basically current Rover wiping their memories. And so Lady Flora, because like the only reason she was in the Blackshores was because of Rover, she decides to also wipe her memories. And she starts wandering Solaris again, right? And eventually she would wake up in Petalfall Village, right? This is the second time she's been in Petalfall Village. But unlike in Petalfall Village when she met Rover the first time, where it was like inhabitant full of people, the Petalfall Village she went to a second time is now desolate and it's been abandoned for hundreds of years, right? And essentially, so she wakes up in Petalfall Village after she wipes her memories again, and she wanders around Solaris for 20 years, completely on accident. She actually stumbles upon the Blackshores again. She registers as Camellya, and then basically the whole main story quest happens. She realizes that she was actually in the Black Shores before for hundreds of years as Lady Flora, right? But now she is Camellya, right? So you can kind of already see there's not only a massive amount of time, but there's so many different questions and just potential when it comes to the mystery like just behind Camellya's character, okay? So now that we've gone through the chronology, let's go to the next thing. Because we also have a clue from Ameth's story that Camellya was in contact with Ameth when Rover was in their pre-memory wipe past, right? And if we kind of check the chronology, we can kind of see that this is most likely going to be Lady Flora, not Camellya, because Camellya would wipe their memories and become Camellya after Rover memory wiped. So Rover took care of Ameth before they wiped their memory, so it has to be Lady Flora, right? And you can kind of see here that basically Lady Flora even, for example, kind of like came into contact with Ameth, and Ameth even has a voice line where she says that she used to chase Exoswarm across the frostlands of Camellya, stuff like that. And she also says that Camellya's health has always been a bit unstable, so make sure you check on her, right? And this is just like a meme I made on the right-hand side. I don't think chasing after Exoswarm is a very safe thing to do when it comes to children, but we just let them do what they want to do, okay? So anyhow, the predominant question that you can probably see already from here is that Camellya is incredibly old, right? I would personally say that Camellya is at the very minimum as old as Frolova, or she is older than Frolova. But unlike Frolova, who remembers everything, Camellya constantly wipes her memories, right? And because of that, she kind of lives based on instinct, right, rather than memories, because memories are too painful and they cause her like physical injury. But we actually learn at the very end of the story, within her 5th character story, that Camellya is trying to use the Black Shore Stellar Matrix to figure out the truth behind her past. So there's that, right? So of course, after we go through the chronology, we go through all the information, there's tons of information and questions that we have about Camellya, which is why I really just call her like the potential woman, right? Because there's so much things we don't know, and if there is going to be a character that kind of like is important in the future, I think a lot of people are not paying attention to Camellya enough, right? So a couple of questions we're just going to go through. The first question is, we know that basically with a near certainty that Camellya is artificial, right? So the first question is, what organization even constructed Camellya, like made her, right? It's most likely not the Thraxtus, because it's mentioned in a story where it was revealed that she's artificial, that during that time, many factions were opposing and watching Rover, right? So it's most likely not the Thraxtus, not just, I'll talk about this later, but I don't actually think the Thraxtus was technologically capable of making Camellya, right? But it's most likely not the Thraxtus, but if it's not the Thraxtus, then what do these organizations want to do with Rover? Why do they want to hunt Rover down so much? They made Camellya as a artificial assassin to kill them, basically, right? The other thing is that we get tons of clues that Camellya is artificial. Like, there's tons of quotes in the story you can kind of see here that she's been like injected with drugs. She has like kind of like this biological coding administered. It's like this mysterious substance that she has to kind of like consume and like basically be like submerged in. So we don't exactly know how she was made, right? We don't even know how she was created, what sort of technology was used. Because what's really interesting, we'll touch on this later, is that because we don't know how Camellya was constructed, we have even less of a clue about Camellya than like Daniel or something. We don't know how her body works, right? Because you need to think about this way. There's a lot of really long living characters within Wuthering Waves. You have, for example, Shorekeeper, and Shorekeeper's story states that because she is basically kind of like made of remnant crystals, she is capable of constantly fixing herself from injuries. And we have Frolova, whose forte basically makes her immortal, basically, so she doesn't have to care about fixing herself. But Camellya doesn't have any of this, right? Yet, we know that for like maybe thousands of years, she's thrown herself just into dangerous situations and fighting and just running around. And even in spite of that, her body shows no signs of breaking down. The only thing that really breaks her down are emotions, right? Like it almost feels like there's functionally nothing that can physically harm Camellya's body, which is really interesting because we know that she's an artificial construct. So we'll talk about that a bit later because I have a theory for that, what that like about kind of like why her body is so durable. But anyway, we also have to talk about her Blossom, right? Because like we can see visually that of course, if you play Camellya, you know, like she has like kind of like all of her forte, like her blossoms and vines stem from her heart, right? And the only artificial resonator that we know of, Denia, has a heart pumped full of void matter, right? So I find it rather interesting that we have these two, like, you know, artificial resonators. They have a lot of similarities, and they all have such plot importance, but we don't focus on Camellya, especially because we'll talk about this later. We don't actually know what Camellya's forte is, right? But anyhow, what exactly is the thing that pushes Camellya to keep on yearning and basically get pulled like a magnet towards Rover? We have no idea, because in her main story quest, it's kind of inferred that no matter the timeline, Camellya will always find Rover again, right? But it's almost like this kind of like a supernatural fate pulling force. But we know that the reason why she keeps following Rover is actually not because she wants to, but because she was engineered to do so. She's an assassin that was specifically built to kill Rover. So what kind of drugs, what kind of substances, even what kind of biological coding was put into place to make her constantly chase Rover? We have no idea about that either, right? So next slide. There's even more questions. We don't exactly know what Camellya's forte is. If you check Camellya's resonator report, it says absolutely nothing about what her forte is, like what her powers are. Like we can only observe visually, and from what we can observe visually, it's already really interesting, right? Because we can see that she makes like, you know, these vines, these camellia flowers, all of these like plant-like material out of nothing. She creates this material basically out of her own energy. And one thing that's really interesting is that these things, she can make it so that these like materials that she makes do not just disintegrate, right? Because in her stories, it's said that she can make a flower that was born from her very being, and it would never wither or decay unless she herself, her main body, perish. So the materials she makes are not only created from her own energy and being, but they are permanent, and that's really big, right? Like this is not something you can just do normally, okay? So that's like her forte. We don't even know what her forte is. Besides that, of course, obvious question, we don't even know how old she is. Like we know she's really, really, really old, but we don't exactly know exactly how much. If we look at her fifth character story, for example, we know that there is a quote that says that she is older than the lament, which I don't know if that means she's older than the entire lament or she's older than a specific part of the lament, but she's really old, right? And she knows a lot of stuff. I think we talked about already, she literally understands and has at one point known the secrets of not just Rover, her own being, but also the world of Solaris and the nature of the Laments themselves. And with that topic in mind, what is it that she knows that is so traumatic that she has to constantly repress her memories? Because we said before, her memory deletion, of course, manifests like really like traumatic and physical consequences, but she almost is an analog of Rover who has to wipe the knowledge that she's learned just to keep on going, right? And for all intents and purposes, like we just don't know so much. There's so much potential behind Camellya's character that nobody talks about for some reason. Like, as I said before, like she could be some like, you know, first generation, like new fed, like super homunculus or whatever from like 900 years ago. and that knows the secrets of the world itself, and nobody's talking about Camellya. Everyone's obsessed with Chisa for some reason, right? So anyhow, let's go on to talking about this, right? One thing I found really interesting I don't think a lot of people talk about is the Fraxters, right? Because the Fraxters we've known from kind of like 2.7 and 3.1 know a lot about Rover and the Blackshores, right? In 2.7, we had Cristoforo kind of like going on this whole spiel before, like, when Rover stepped in the Journeying Paradise, saying that, you know, stuff about Shorekeeper, stuff about Abby, like, they know who Shorekeeper is. She was born in the Sonoro. They know about the Tethys system. They know about Abby, right? They know of Frenodian's essences within Abby, and that kind of like they can exploit Abby like to do something, and possibly they even know about Abraxas. They know about Abby, and the Grand Architect even knows about Rover, because Navora says in 3.1 that my real favorite things are the ones that are really old and far, far away, and they was talking about Rover, of course, and the ancient civilization, right? But have you ever noticed that even in 1.0, the Fraxters constantly tail Rover, but Camellya was constantly tailing Rover as well in 1.0. The Fraxters never, ever have talked about Camellya. They haven't even mentioned her name. They've never talked about who she is. It's almost like she doesn't exist, or like maybe you can say that she's like a puppet kind of like placed in there, but I feel like she's actually so old that she predates a lot of the Fraxters' activity. So maybe Camellya is such an ancient and enigmatic existence that even the Fraxters don't know about her, because they know about Shorekeeper. That's pretty big, but they never mention Camellya. And it's like, maybe it's like, even it's like funny because the Fraxters, like, Camellya doesn't know what she's thinking. The Fraxters doesn't even know what she's thinking, right? I found that very oddly suspicious. So next thing is, if you check kind of like Camellya's precious item, you will kind of notice that basically we already know that Camellya is old, right? But you can see that her bracelet resembles a cherished gift from a bygone era. And when you combine that with the fact that in her character stories, it's mentioned that centuries went by, right? But in Chinese, it's actually a phrase that more so connotes not centuries as in hundreds of years, but like a millennia, like thousands of years, like a really, really long time. So I honestly don't think that she is like hundreds of years old. I think she's at least 1,000 or thousands of years old, right? I personally, as I said before, I personally think she's definitely older than at least Frolova. But I think I kind of made my point here. She's really, really, really old, okay? So, on the topic of basically this kind of like pendant, I've tried to actually translate the bottom of what it says, but it's too blurry. The top line looks a little bit like a serial number. The bottom line is too blurry, I can't do it. It was said that this is designed by Blackshores. I was really interested in kind of like if it was like basically giving us a clue about this so-called bygone era, but you know, like, we'll see how it goes. Like, if there's going to be something that's interesting about Camellya in the future, I think it may tie into her bracelet. That's a possibility. So anyhow, right? So now we've talked about basically the lore of Camellya, like the reasonable inferences and what we know about Camellya based on her character stories and the lore that is objectively available to us. And now we're going into tinfoil territory, because I want to present a theory that I've actually had for a couple months now, because I've wanted to talk about Camellya for a really long time. And in order to fully understand this first, we need to talk about something. We need to talk about the Her civilization. And a lot of you guys have wanted me to talk about this because the Her civilization has been a pretty hot topic, of course, not just within the EN community, but also the CN community, right? And one of the things I've always been really confused about with the Her civilization is not really the origins, right? Because we know about the Her civilization from Shangling Yao and also the CSC lab in Jinzhou, but even though it may be Rover civilization, I'm not fully sold on the idea that the Her civilization is directly Rover's homeland civilization, because I don't think that's provable beyond doubt as of current. But one thing that's really interesting is the translation of this into Chinese, right? One thing I was always confused on with the Her civilization is that if you check this lore entry, within kind of like the CSC lab, the Court of Cervantes lab, you play the Chinese version, you will see that the Her civilization is spelled like this in Chinese, right? And the really interesting thing is that basically, the last two words basically just mean civilization. But the first word is really interesting, right? Because the Her civilization game uses a Chinese word for her, which is grain, not her, which is river, right? If you could just like listen to what I just said, you will notice that those two words sound exactly the same. They're almost like identical, right? And what was really interesting when I saw this for the first time is that I always thought that the Her civilization was talking about the river civilization, right? This version of her. And to me, that would make like tons of sense because the Her civilization, the river civilization, is just a link to Chinese culture because the very first like Chinese people settled along the Yellow River. That was one of the cradles of civilization. And the first dynasty was also the one that sprouted up along its banks, being the Shang dynasty, right? So if the Her civilization was just meaning the river civilization, then it just means that they're kind of like a progenitor, the kind of like race, right? That would be like really easy to understand. But that's not the case because the Her in Her civilization refers to grain, not river. And after thinking for a while, I kind of came to the inference or conclusion that if it's a grain civilization, it may be linked to this idea that it's actually, this civilization is kind of like seeding or planting seeds like sentinels in order to kind of like sprout and eventually create civilizations that would kind of like emerge across, Solaris. And we have actually some evidence of this because, for one, Rover, even though it's not 100% confirmed, is really kind of like closely linked to the idea that they are existing within Huanglong's founding myths, right? A celestial being descended, they were the first to kind of like create Huanglong, demarcate these 7 cities, and also they were the ones that kind of absorbed tacit discourse with their bare hands. That's kind of like a link to Rover, right? So Rover most likely appears within the Huanglong kind of like, legends, and they were the ones that created that sort of like land. Besides that, it's just kind of like the Chenkong and like Pangu is like based on Chinese mythology, real Chinese mythology. Pangu is the one that basically held heaven from like then the cosmos from crashing down and descending upon the mortal world. So kind of like the Eastern version of Atlas who holds up the world. And beyond kind of like Rover's interference with Huanglong's founding, we also get direct evidence that Rover and Imperator, being a sentinel, were the ones that actually didn't just create, but planned out the process of Rinascita's civilization, right? Because Imperator says, once we drafted the blueprint for the Seaborn Kin are the first people that came to Rinascita on boats, right? And we can see that within the civilization capsule, Rover and Imperator store the data that they wanted to do to basically guide the course of Rinascita's civilization, right? So there is this idea that basically Rover is kind of like planting sentinels and like these plans, these blueprints, like a first blueprint that seeds and kind of like germinates into a kind of civilization, right? And one thing I find really interesting with all this knowledge of like this supposed Her civilization, this grain civilization, or whatever, rather than the river civilization, is that Camellya, within one of her character stories, is directly quoted as being a chosen seed of her organization. A chosen seed is a very, very interesting designation, especially because this isn't kind of like just something she said, but her official title within that organization, right? She is a chosen seed that will flower and bloom for the sole purpose of hunting down Rover, right? So it's really interesting. You can kind of already perhaps begin making the links that maybe the Her civilization made, like Camellya, but there's one more piece of evidence I want to present, right? And that is Camellya's body, because Camellya has spent, as far as we know, thousands of years just constantly fighting, being damaged. And as we said before, she doesn't have Shorekeeper's self-repair functions. She doesn't have Philova's immortality. Yet, it almost feels like Camellya's body is physically incapable of being damaged she can only be affected by like mental trauma, right? So the question I want to pose is that if her body is so durable and so long lasting, and she is artificial, right? What kind of technology on Earth was used to make her body so strong that she's still perfectly fine like thousands of years later? I think that a possible reason, this is very tinfoil, take this with a grain of salt, of course, is that her civilization is the one that made Camellya, right? Especially not just because that she was a chosen seed, but I can't really envision a lot of people, a lot of like organizations that, as of current, that would have the technology capable to make someone like Camellya, right? We've seen the Court of Savante, we've seen how they have space tech and stuff like that, but even I don't think they're technologically advanced enough to make Camellya. I don't even think the Fraxis, especially back then, were technologically capable of making Camellya. So I think that really Camellya seems to be made like, it seems to be like a homunculus. And if you don't know what a homunculus is, it's like an artificial kind of like biologically artificial human. She's like a homunculus made with incredibly advanced technology, possibly to her civilization. And as I said before, she was designed to kill Rover, right? So I don't think that actually the her civilization is directly Rover's homeland civilization, but I do think they are very closely linked together. That is correct. But I don't think they're like one and the same, right? So with that, we kind of know she's a very advanced kind of homunculus. She has immense potential, but we just don't know who she is, right? So I kind of like, my own headcanon, I guess you can say, is that Camellya seems to be like this very advanced, you know, first generation homunculus, like this artificial resonator that was made by like an incredibly advanced civilization or organization like the her civilization or whatever, but she was designated as a little bit of a failure because of her condition, which we know is vegetative somatization. She is very affected by emotions and trauma, and they can translate into physical injury. So the way I kind of like to think about it is that Camellya is most likely this super ancient, kind of like a super advanced prototype that had kind of like flaws that designated her a kind of failed experiment, right? It's kind of like, I think it's like in the Terminator or something, like Arnold Schwarzenegger is like kind of like an outdated Terminator or whatever. It's kind of like that if you want to imagine it that way. But you can kind of see, like, with all the things we covered in this video, the amount of potential that Camellya has is, like, to put it bluntly, fucking astounding, right? We still don't know what kind of technology made her body. Like, when we look at Denia, like, Denia's body is vastly inferior to Camellya, right? Camellya is like thousands of years old. She's thrown herself into war like a battle junkie 24/7. She's still alive and she's still kicking. And she has an unexplored power. We don't even know what Camellya's forte is yet. We can only see how it works visually. And since Camellya wipes her memory so often, she may herself not even know the extent of her powers. But she was powerful enough. And this is like the longest period she went without wiping her memories, was when she was Lady Flora, right? Operating as basically Rover's right-hand, kind of like right-hand woman, I guess you can say, in the Black Shores. During the centuries that she was active in the Black Shores as Lady Flora, she was so strong that she was basically the second in command, right? So that's really important. And also, of course, her age is really important. She knows so much about the world. She's basically Frolova tier or over in terms of kind of like age. And what's also really important is that unlike all these characters that seem to know everything, like Frolova, like the Grand Architect, you know, and all that, Camellya is actually like an ally, right? Like, you can't just ask the Grand Architect the secret of the world because they're not going to tell you, right? But Camellya has a potential to actually reveal to you some secrets if she, for example, recovers her memory or she makes some effort to dig into her past. And that's something that she's actively trying to do, right? As we said before, when Camellya knows everything, she literally unlocks the secrets of the world. She understands the reason for her being, she understands the secret of Solaris and the Lament, and it's actually noted within her character stories that even though she told Rover that she doesn't remember anything, that was a lie, right? She was lying to that. So she hadn't completely lost all memories of her past. And she was actually, the reason why she didn't follow Rover to Renesida and kind of like Lahairo and stuff is that she wanted to investigate her own past. So there is a very heavy potential that Camellya shows up later on in the story in order to actually kind of like reveal that she's figured out, okay, she's discovered herself, because she is like a treasure trove, like a treasure chest, but she herself does not have the key, right? She knows so much about the world, has so much potential. That's why I call her the potential woman. But she herself needs to unlock her kind of like deeply, for example, repressed memories. So with that out of the way, you can kind of see, I've just kind of put on the screen here tons of like really suspicious, you know, like voice lines from Camellya that now that we are in 3.3 perhaps are more important, right? You can kind of see how in this line, Camellya is somehow alive. Her body is like indestructible. Also, Camellya very early on said something in her final thought section. So you need max intimacy to unlock this line. If you ever get tired of this whole savior business, do let me know. What will I do? That's a secret, right? And considering within Lahairo, we talked a lot about Rover's savior complex, I think this line is a bit more interesting than it was before, right? Especially because when Camellya was first introduced as a character, they never talked about this whole savior thing, you know? But now that we look at it, it's really suspicious. And also, Camellya is a little bit of a nihilist, just like Denia, right? She doesn't care about responsibility and ideals, but unlike Denia, who is like a true nihilist, Camellya is more like an instinctually driven person, but she thinks that these values are all just a lie to tell ourselves, to make ourselves feel better, right? So it's really interesting because Camellya doesn't like the Black Shores. She doesn't actually believe in the Black Shores ideals. She's only there because of Rover. And you know, that's already a little bit suspicious in itself, but have it as you will, right? And the other thing with Camellya is that she's wandered across Solaris so much that there is nothing in Solaris that is worth her time, nothing in Solaris that she thinks can actually defeat her, right? And that is a very strong assertion to make that perhaps could kind of show just how much power she has. Because remember, the current Camellya that we are playing, that has access to, has only been awake for like 20 years. So besides finding out her past memories, she's like mentally 20 years old, right? But when it comes to how long she's actually lived, how much experience in total that she has accrued, it's centuries, thousands of years. And because Camellya is so young, I don't think she actually knows the true extent of her power, which is why she seems so weak as of current. But anyway, as we said before, so much potential. I think that it is time that we need to, perhaps as a community, dethrone Chisa, because unless she does something majestic in 3.4, like defeat Aleph 1's creation or whatever, there is clearly, as we went through in this video, someone who is much more deserving of the title of potential woman, right? Hopefully I've made my case to you, perhaps given you a bit of insight into just how interesting of a character Camellya is. And with that out of the way, hopefully you guys have a great rest of the day. Next video, I'll kind of like see what I do. I'm not actually sure what to do for the next video, but we'll see how it goes, right? But if you enjoyed, if you want to support me, you can feel free to subscribe. You can send me a donation in comments or even become a channel member. Besides that, hope you guys have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you guys in the next one.